I'm Averie Swanson of Keeping Together, and this is the Brewer to Brewer podcast from All About Beer. My guest is Blake Tyers of Creature Comfort Brewery, and he is here for a conversation that goes beyond the brew house and into topics that matter to brewing professionals and curious beer drinkers. First, please visit allaboutbeer.com and follow on social media at allaboutbeer. And to support journalism in the beer space, check out patreon.com/allaboutbeer. We'll get into the conversation in just a moment, but first, this message.
First Tee is a proud sponsor of the Brewer to Brewer podcast. Some of the brightest brewers across the country have discovered the First Tee advantage. Hill Farmstead, Sweetwater Brewing Company, and Angry Chair are among the many who have used First Tee's unique and quality teas and botanicals to create top-rate beers. First Tee focuses on being direct, flexible, and fast. You can find out more about First Tee's collaboration with brewers and tea ingredients by visiting firstte.com/blog. That's firsdtea.com/blog.
All right, a bit about my guest today. Blake Tyers is a founding member of the Creature Comforts Brewing team and has been with CCBC since 2014. In his role as the Senior Director of Curiosity, Blake helps to grow the Curious Collection, limited release brands, to serve as a creative collaborator and to engage our industry colleagues. He has also served on the Georgia Craft Brewers Guild Board of Directors, presented at the American Society of Brewing Chemists Conference, and has received an honorable mention from the North American Guild of Beer Writers for his contributions to good beer hunting. Blake, I am very excited for this conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat.
Hey, thanks for inviting me, Avery. It's an honor.
The honor is mine. We've been good friends for many years at this point, and you've always been one of my favorite people to chat with about beer and beverage and many other topics. I don't want to blow too much hot air up your skirt, but I think that your approach to beer making is extremely inspiring. You seem to embrace both the science and the art of what you do. And I think that every time we chat, I walk away energized and feeling like I've learned something new. So I think where I want to start is just getting kind of your story. Like, how did you get here? What brought you to the beer industry? And, what has your path looked like since you became a brewer?
Oh yeah. Well, thanks. I'll say the same. You directly have an influence after we talk on some beers that we made in the past, and it's been for the better always. So let's see. I guess it starts with just kind of, for me, being indoctrinated into the culture of beer. I was lucky that my dad and my father's side of the family is from England. And so the baseline for beer was a little bit higher than what you would expect. So growing up, I always saw Bass around, and it wasn't uncommon for Sierra Nevada Pale Ale to be in there as well. Also with that came the mentality of, hey, if you ever want a beer, just talk to me about it. And let's have a beer. So my first beer was actually a cask of a pint of Old Speckled Hen in London with my dad and my grandfather when I was like 14.
Amazing.
And
that is amazing.
That was my beginning of getting into beer. And throughout all that, as I kind of got older, I went through different waves. Certainly drank my fair share of bad beer in college. But then started wanting to drink the more flavorful stuff like Honey Brown and Michelob, like regular Michelob, and
Yes.
Any beer with a little bit more flavor. And then I had a friend of mine that I met that in college was a home brewer. And it didn't really strike me right away that that's something I wanted to do. I just thought it was pretty amazing, and I was really into it. At the time, I was also really into just beer, the culture of beer. That's kind of where I started. I didn't start with making beer. So I would go to, there was a pub in Athens that would do a cask tapping the first Wednesday of every month. And a guy there, Owen Ogletree in Athens, he would curate an experience where they actually showed Michael Jackson's old show, The Beer Hunter. So we'd be drinking cask ale and watching that. And I was, 21, and I was like, this is cool stuff. So got into all that, and then moved to Decatur and started going to the Brick Store pub right out of college. And I think that's one of the best beer bars in the world. And certainly got to experience a lot of things in Georgia, our ABV cap on beer that was allowed to be sold was 6% until 2014, I think.
Yeah.
And so like I remember vividly like when Stone launched in Atlanta and we had a tap takeover at Brickstore Pub. And then along about that same time when I was living in Decatur, I discovered that my grandfather used to homebrew, and the stories were always about the bottles exploding in the garage and things like that. He wasn't a guy for precision, but more of a guy for just kind of doing things himself. And so I grabbed his old homebrewing kit that happened to still be at my grandmother's house.
Oh,
And
wow.
I started making beer on it. And really simple at first, doing like mixed extract brewing and stuff like that. And then I moved out of the country and I came back, and through all that, I ended up with like no homebrewing gear. But through all of that time, I was still very much engaged in beer as a thing. Like I lived in New Zealand at the time, and now there's a very big beer scene in New Zealand. But at the time, there wasn't. There was, there's no tier system, so it was all tied houses. There's no distribution network for small breweries. So I would actually like get my friends to send me a case of American beers to New Zealand, which was kind of crazy in hindsight. But and my friends there thought I was nuts, but I always wanted to stay on top of it. And then I came back and I had two friends that had really nice homebrewing kits. So it's kind of like a gypsy homebrewer. I started using their homebrewing setups, got them to, teach me what they knew, and then use their stuff to start brewing at home. And over a few years, it became like a really big passion of mine. Entered competitions, was in a homebrew club. It's funny, the homebrew club I was in was a lot of brewers around Atlanta now that have breweries, like Halfway Crooks. That's how we met. We were in the same homebrew club and
Really?
we lived together. Yeah.
I didn't know
Um,
that.
yeah. So it's just, it's where we all kind of got together at that point in time. And then a friend of a friend, one of the guys whose systems I was making beer on, he was college buddies with the guy starting up Creature Comforts. And he's like, hey, I got some friends starting up a brewery. They need a brewer that is creative, and you seem to fit that bill. You should meet him. And so when I got introduced to him, I was just kind of like, I'm not going to give you guys the option of hiring anybody else. I'm going to be your guy. So I was a photographer at the time, and decided to stop doing that and go help open Creature Comforts. And that's really what took me off to the races. And since then, I've really been passionate about the culture and philosophy of beer making and flavor in general. I always like to understand what makes people think the way they do about making a beer instead of just how they're making the beer. Because I think you learn a lot from studying how people think about making beer. And that's certainly what I did when I was trying to learn how to make different styles of beer. I would just do deep dive case studies and research everything I possibly could about a brewer and everything they said in every interview to figure out how they're thinking about making beer. And that's really kind of where I got. And now, here I am 10 years later at Creature Comforts, been doing the thing. It's been pretty good.
Wow. So you've been at Creature for 10 years at this point.
Yeah, this is our 10th year open. We had our 9th anniversary in April.
Wow. How wild. So over the course of your time there, I feel like you've done a lot of different things. And one of the last times we hung out, which I think may have been, honestly, it's been too long. It's been maybe almost a year. I think would have been at Snallygaster, and you were telling me that your role was about to be changing.
Mm-hmm.
So your title in your bio is Director of Curiosity, which is probably one of the best titles I think I've heard. I love that. So I guess I would like for you to tell us a little bit more about what that title kind of means, what your role in, with that title is. What does a typical day look like for you at work?
Sure. Yeah. So, being like, when we opened up, we had 5 people. And so you kind of do a little bit of everything. Through that time, I brewed and did, everything in production at the beginning. And then I was our first head brewer. And then I kind of got more specialized into managing our barrel program, as you know, after a while, as we continued to grow and be more specialized. And then with the way things are, like we've grown quite a bit now. We make a whole lot of beer, and it changed where last year I was kind of managing our original brewing facility, and trying to operate it kind of like a small brewery with inside of a bigger brewery. And there were some really good things that came along with that, and also some challenges. It doesn't necessarily make sense to kind of have those redundancies in an organization. So this year I moved over where I'm actually not directly brewing anymore, but I'm helping give birth an idea to the limited release program of all of our beers, and working with our brewing team and those guys to kind of help generate the idea behind the beers and making compelling stories behind it, asking questions on what should we be exploring for, like processes and ingredients and styles and what do we want to do, as well as in connecting that piece to the consumer facing market and the accounts, and like how do we sell all these different styles of beer. Because what we've really done over the last couple of years, and we've always kind of felt that we like to be brewers that have the skill set to brew kind of all these classic styles, and we really enjoy making kind of a little bit of everything. But it's not necessarily easy to always just sell a little bit of everything. So that was kind of a big thing that I took on, was figuring out how we are going to connect the dots from, we want to make all sorts of styles of beer. And I knew there were these accounts and plate bars out there that wanted to be able to serve all of those, but those aren't necessarily also the bars that say like, we just want your IPA or whatever. So creating that system where we're able to sell those beers through kind of a pipeline, without distracting away from our major market moves, because, frankly, those like Tropicalia is still our number one selling beer. But we felt like it's important part of our culture and what we want to do. And also we get so much as like brewing expertise and reps, and front of house expertise and reps, and sales expertise and reps, by going through all these different styles and learning how to do the different processes to make those beers, or how to talk about those beers, or the culture behind those beers. I think there's learning opportunities everywhere across the organization. And that's where like kind of curiosity comes in. We call our limited release program the Curious Collection. And for us, fundamentally, Crave Curiosity is one of our fundamental pillars. It's one of our I can't think of the word right now, but it is
values.
Like we have, thank you. It's one of our values.
Company values.
Yeah, we have a set of values, and one of them is Crave Curiosity. And we feel like, that's always been there since the beginning. By continuing to ask questions and really being curious, it usually leads you down a path of knowledge, and also understanding yourself and understanding the world, which we felt like allows you to enjoy the creature comforts of life better. So being that is like a fundamental value of ours, and I have that title, it sounds kind of hokey. And I go through this a lot because, I'm meeting people and I explain my title, but I truly think it's important, and I try to take it seriously. That my joke is I try to help people ask the right questions. But I want to keep our people and people we are serving beer to all across, our footprint, engaged in beer and in curiosity and learning. And it's just more fun that way. And we all learn something from it. And I think our beers are better for it. Even if we're
Totally.
making, an IPA and a lager as our top two selling brands, by taking these other styles and going through them and trying different things, we're learning pieces that can go apply to those main brands, or just be, ways we can make our organization better. So, it's kind of what I do now. So I do a lot of education. I go teach classes. I talk to folks, and also help challenge the brew team with like authenticity to the style, and ideas, and really try to create and curate a great beer program that we make.
That's amazing. Yeah, I love the idea of curiosity as something that you can begin to cultivate within your business or organization. When I started keeping together a few years back, one of my kind of like the mission statement, I guess, of the company was to increase the collective empathy of the world, and through beer. And I've spent plenty of time kind of digging into what that actually means. And I guess, to put it into more of a succinct conversation here, I think that you cannot really have empathy if you do not have curiosity. Like you need to have curiosity, you need to have a little bit of self-awareness, and you need to have the interest in understanding other people and, you know, other topics in order to really grow. So I think that it's an incredible thing that Creature Comforts has developed this position for you. And like you become kind of the connective tissue across the business, you know, bringing what would otherwise be pretty disparate uh, departments together. Um, Honestly, I could see that becoming very much the direction that a lot of other companies begin to move in, as at least within the beer industry, as they continue to kind of come up against some of the challenges that the industry has seen over the last few years. So I think that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
it's like I like, I'll go talk to distributors and I'll teach them about our beers and how we talk about our beers. But then I'll also sit in leadership meetings where, I could try to challenge people to actually be curious. To your point, I think truly understanding not just your medium or your craft by being curious, but also other people, like what you're saying. Like if you're truly curious about others and you remain that way, it allows you to offer so much more grace to humans and
Totally.
understanding. And it also makes you want to sit down and have a beer with them and ask them what they're all about. Right. So that's what it comes down to, is that fundamentally, like, we try to keep people and bring people together, like creating culture around bringing people together is kind of the most important thing for beer. I think that everyone aligns with at Creature Comforts. And it's like, if you got to, it's the old, it goes back to the old, like, English, at least in my head, references. The pub is where you learned about what's going on in your town. It's where you talked about problems with your neighbors. But it was all over a beer. And so it wasn't, we're going to have a fight. It was, we're going to respect each other and be curious about each other's opinions. And I love that. I think it's a great thing. You just gave me chills talking about it.
Yeah. I similarly have goosebumps. I'm like, beer is like so much bigger than, you know, the day-to-day brewing and some of the I don't know, the crap that we have to deal with on like sales side and things like that, and trying to explain to people what we're doing. But at the end of the day, it is such an incredible tool of connection, and just like, or rather avenue of connection with other humans. And I know you feel similarly, that like I'm very grateful to be a beer maker and to be in this industry. So um, one question I do have for you about kind of this transition from being like a full-time production employee and being kind of in the trenches and sweating and, you know, all of the amazing elements of actually working production. I feel like for a lot of us brewers, as we get older, both physically and, you know, in our roles at our respective breweries, I think most people come to a point where they're like, well, am I going to do this forever? Like my back hurts, you know, or like, because it's not, you know, it can be pretty grueling work. And at some point, I feel like most of us get to this place where we're like, well, okay, am I going to be doing the manual labor forever? Or, you know, will moving into a more administrative or management type role be a more sustainable long-term career path? And I think a lot of brewers struggle with this kind of transition. At least I feel like I have struggled a little bit with that. And I've talked to a number of other people that have kind of shared similar ideas. But, you know, I feel like brewers are very proud to be in the trenches doing those things. And there's almost kind of a like, I don't want to go be on the computer all the time. But at some point, you know, you can't be breaking your back doing the manual labor thing forever. And I think to be able to bring the institutional knowledge that you have and the process knowledge you have into other elements of a business is really a fantastic way of transitioning away from that manual labor. So like, how has that process really been for you, kind of, you know, like psychologically? Like, did you struggle with that transition at all, or were you kind of more excited to move into more of a liaison type, administrative type role?
Oh yeah, we're going to talk about this for the rest of the podcast. No, I think there's a lot of pieces to this. And I'm going to try to make sure I can remember to talk about all of them. But first off, you're totally right. I was full on, I would say, production employee for probably 7 years. Many of those years, I was doing overnights, and for up until about year 4, I think we were still on our original 30-barrel brew house, and we got up to doing like 35,000 barrels on a 30-barrel. So we were
Wow.
brewing 24/5, and it was just bonkers. And that was physically demanding, for sure, but then there is absolutely this channel of growth that allows you to come from that, where you can specialize in whatever your craft is. And, I was going kind of down the barrel route and doing all those things. And so much of your identity, particularly, I don't know if it feels different now. Maybe it's just because of we're older or whatever, but, I guess it was 5 years ago or so, like so much of my identity was as being a brewer for Creature Comforts. And that was what got me to travel to places, what got me to talk to people. It's what opened doors and opportunities for me to be able to experience things. And even now, like when I meet up with old friends and I tell them I don't brew anymore, I can like detect a level of disappointment in them. And
Yeah.
it's really challenging on your like mental psyche, because I personally think that what I'm doing now is maybe more challenging than what I was doing before, in the sense that I'm trying to be a leader and inspire people to become the best versions of themselves as brewers and as people making beer, or as people who are selling beer or talking about it. And that is a completely different skill set, obviously, than making beer, but it's a long-term reward that is probably higher than making beer. Like there's nothing better than like making a lights out beer and serving to someone and seeing them just light up. I love that.
Yeah.
But I guess I said there's nothing better, but maybe something is better than that. And what it can be is helping more people experience that, where you can help get more people to be able to see their vision and their dream come true. And and I talk to myself in my head about this kind of stuff all the time, where it's like, I just need to have confidence and complacency with myself, that it's okay that I'm not, identified, or I don't hang my hat on being a brewer anymore. I still know just as much as I knew before about making beer. I could still help people, and that is really what I'm trying to do with that. And I think that's ultimately more rewarding for me. And it's funny, like now, I think before, just like a little aside, I think before, I might get a bunch of inspiration 5 years ago from watching like a taco documentary, versus now I'm like getting inspiration on being a leader from like Ted Lasso, like where it's, how can I help people be what they want to be in this space, and offer a good way of life for them. Because I think when you're younger, you don't think as holistically about it. It's all in, it's all consuming. When we were back in the day doing the grind of getting the brewery up and running, it was not even close to a 40-hour a week job. Like you're all in all the time. Not to mention you're doing like 10-ish hour days or whatever, but you're also like, when you're off, you're still in brewer mode, thinking about it all the time. What beers can I make next? What's going on with that beer that's in the tank right now? What's that problem I got to solve? So there's a lot there. And I think over time, it's, I just realized that I need to derive my value from more, what's the word I'm looking for? More substantial things than just praise over making a cool beer, right? Like my value should be wrapped in a more holistic experience about having a positive influence on humans and a culture of a place and a town and a city and a state. And that's where over time, it started with little things like, how many farms can I work with my projects? And then now it's turned into, how can I help influence the direction of our company or the people that are other people leaders, to create better jobs for those people or have a better impact on our community and things like that. It's not nearly as sexy as being the rock star or whatever, but I think ultimately it's probably It's probably a more fulfilling long-term thing. But it doesn't mean like I'm 2-ish years into some transitions here, right? And it still feels like a constant thought process of like, I just went to dinner like 2 weeks ago with some friends I haven't seen in 5 or 6 years, and I was like, I'm not really brewing anymore, and then you just get that, oh, well, what do you do? And it's like, I do cool stuff. Like,
Yeah.
it's just different. But I'm grateful that I've allowed this growth, because what it does provide is a better balance for me from a work-life balance, like much more happy in a holistic sense that, I have engagements outside of brewing life. And it's allowed me to, just like I work from home a lot, or I live in Atlanta now, so I'm able to move around and go to places and kind of take what I do with me. And it's not, so I'm tied into being in the brew house all the time, doing that stuff. So, as you were asking the question, I was like making check marks in my head of like things to go through. But yeah, ultimately, I think that's probably the most important part of it all, is just allowing grace for myself, because it is a challenging thing when your identity kind of moves. And now I'm realizing that I had so much creativity poured into brewing before that I, for the first time in probably 20 years of working or so, and going all the way back into like middle school, where I don't have an active creative outlet. And so I'm working really hard to get that back in my life. Like I'm probably going to go buy a drum set again here soon, because I need to play music or something. So yeah, it's just a shift where you find healthy balance where the job doesn't have to be everything anymore. And it's a tough transition, but I think it's a healthy one to make.
Yeah, I love all of that. And I think that that's really important for a lot of people in the beer industry to hear. Like you were saying, it's easy when you finally get yourself into that position that you really want to be, like as a brewer, and so much of your identity is wrapped up in it. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. You don't have to be, like you said, the rock star brewer in order to be a major contributor to the things being made in the company as it's presented to other people in the industry or to consumers or anything. You can still be, I don't know. It sounds like what you are doing, the position that you're in, is creating a ton of value for the company. And I think for any brewers that are out there that might be considering what is next after, a decade or more of production manual labor, like, there are positions that you can create that really do further the interests of the company you're with and yourself creatively and, in a career sense. So I think all of that's amazing.
It allows me to grow, which is nice. It's a new challenge, and looking at it that way, I think, is a little easier to take than just saying it's just different, right? It's
Yeah.
a challenge for growth, and I appreciate it a lot.
We are going to take a short break for this message and then come right back for more of this conversation with Blake Tyers of Creature Comforts.
First Tee is a proud sponsor of the Brewer to Brewer podcast. Some of the brightest brewers across the country have discovered the First Tee advantage. Hill Farmstead, Sweetwater Brewing Company, and Angry Chair are among the many who have used First Tea's unique and quality teas and botanicals to create top-rate beers. First Tee focuses on being direct, flexible, and fast. You can find out more about First Tea's collaboration with brewers and tea ingredients by visiting firstea.com/blog. That's FIRSDTEA.com/blog.
All About Beer is back, and we're asking for your support to help provide the independent beer media this rich and colorful industry deserves. Visit our website, allaboutbeer.com, where we're frequently posting new content. And please consider throwing us a few bucks at patreon.com/allaboutbeer. We have low-cost memberships for individuals and small and large companies alike. Every dollar goes to help produce new articles and podcasts.
All right, welcome back. So we left off kind of chatting a little bit about transitioning from doing production into, a little bit more of a like multifactorial type of position within the brewing space, within Creature Comforts for you. really, I think it's an inspiring story for a lot of brewers. You mentioned when you were talking about that, about kind of how you're approaching creativity and how, your where you're finding inspiration has kind of evolved and changed over the years. You also mentioned drumming, and earlier when you were kind of talking about your story into beer, you mentioned being a photographer. So not everyone knows probably that you were in fact a drummer. You didn't mention the fact that you were a big dancer and did dance, teaching and all of these things. So we're going to have you talk about that for a second also.
Yeah.
And then and then film and photography. So one of the things that I'm very curious about, and I know you and I've talked about this in the past one-on-one, but like how does your background in all of these different things, like clearly you're a very artistic and creative individual. How do you feel like these elements of who you are filter into your beer making? And now in your current position, how do you feel like you are translating that kind of inspiration into what you do?
That's a fun question. Yeah, so my creative outlet journey started probably when I was, I guess, 11 or 12 or whatever, getting to sixth grade. I joined band. A lot of my family, my mom's side of the family is musical. Both my uncles drum. Another uncle of mine's a hell of a guitar player. And, it's weird though, because my mom never really listened to music growing up. It's not her style, but I got into it pretty big. My stepdad's actually a professional trumpet player as well. He went to Berklee College of Music. So there's a lot of musical influence around. And so I joined band, and I did band all the way through college, where I was like in the marching band at UGA. So music shapes a lot about how I think about beer and flavor mapping in my head. And then, which I'll come back to that. But then after that, yeah, I dropped the marching band for 2 years. I did that 2 years in college. And then the last 2 years in college, I was in the university ballroom performance group. And that was a lot of fun. I didn't know what I was getting into at first. My love for dancing really spawned from the music and being able to have an interaction with the music. And being a drummer, I was like, I've got rhythm. That's not a problem. I just got to learn how to move. And I loved that a lot, and it was a lot of fun. And then outside of actually alongside all of that, my grandfather was also a photographer, and the same guy was a home brewer. You can tell I looked up to him a lot. But I had like one of his old film cameras growing up. I remember going to like skate camp and signing up for the photography class. I remember being in the dark room with him as a little kid. So then eventually, before I was a brewer, I was doing photography as my job. I used to take photos on film and television. And I did that for about 4 years. And yeah, right as that was like, I was landing the dream situation as a photographer, where I was going to be paid well, had a career as a person, as an artist. And then I dropped that off to go help start this brewery up, which at the time, it's in hindsight, it seems crazy. At the time, it made total sense. I was like, this is the thing I got to do. And a lot of my friends thought I was kind of nuts, but they also didn't really challenge me on it because they saw that this is what I wanted to do. So through all that, it's weird. I think brewing and photography are really similar creative disciplines, in the sense that the more I've always looked at them both, like the more technical understanding you have, the more you have access to your palette of colors to play with, and you know how to shape your vision better. Your brushstrokes are better, if you will, of understanding how to put something together. And then that's the angle of my brain of how to think about the discipline of my craft. But then the idea of how to form that picture coming together comes from music, where, particularly once we were getting into barrels, and I know you and I have talked about this quite a lot, but blending, I have a very musical place with, where I when I'm blending barrels, I'm thinking about trebles, mids, and bass. I'm thinking about how we're putting chords together and creating like symphonic expressions of flavor rather than singular notes. And that has been a lot of our thread of how we created a barrel program for a long time was, pretty quickly we went from the put thing in a barrel, get rid of the worst part, and thing comes out of a barrel, and that's your project, to we have a Crayola cray box of barrels and we select which crayons we want to create the project, which is oddly how every other discipline of using barrels operates, like winemakers and distilleries and all that. And brewers are the only ones that seem to be audacious enough to assume they know what's going to happen on the other side. But I was like, it's all about blending for me and thinking about this. And I've certainly talked with like you and other like-minded individuals of the year that have really concreted that philosophy. And then I think about that even when writing regular recipes, is thinking about how bitterness and sugar and overall intensity of a beer profile, how that all plays into how it fits. And for me, the thinking behind that is all musical. Absolutely. And so I don't know, I've had a few projects that have come directly from that, where it's just like, to think about how, okay, this is really cool. Like this hop note is cool. But instead of just saying, here's a hop that tastes like grapefruit, for example, why don't we play in that paradigm of taste like grapefruit and expand upon that, so that the timbre, to pull a musical word out, of the hop, it would be similar to like the timbre of a trumpet, but I also want to accompany that with the B flat of a clarinet or of a sousaphone or whatever. You can tell there's more marching background, but putting the music together helps you kind of think about creating more depth to that experience rather than it being like a singular note. And sometimes a solo is cool, but often like the symphonic richness of a project or of sound will make something more interesting. And I always thought that way with blending beer. Like how do I create this symphonic resonance with beer flavor so that it's not just one thing, but it's better as a sum of its parts. So yeah, that musical background certainly played in the way I thought about creating beers, and still does. And even telling the story about beers now, I feel like when I give classes to people or try to talk to people about beer, it's really easy to kind of pull that metaphor in and say, like, let me explain to you like what's going on here. Like hazy IPA, you want to talk about hazy IPA? Yeah, cool. The biggest thing you need to know about hazy IPA is it's actually an IPA with contributions of yeast influence. And I don't mean on the palate. I don't think there should be a whole lot of yeast in your beer, but the ester profile, I think, is where it all began. If you look back at the origins, where people were like, holy cow, like the West Coast is an absence of ester influence, generally speaking, onto that IPA. And then where you look in the East Coast, there's kind of an addition of that ester influence, and it allows you to emphasize or influence what those hops can taste like. And that's how I think we got to the prototype of where the new hop growing is going, as far as like what hops are coming out. Like you look at like Nectaron, the way people I think tried to achieve that flavor before Nectaron existed was a combination of hops we had on hand and yeast esters. And now the hop breeding is catching up to that influence, and actually people are pushing yeast as well, but it's ultimately that quest, right? And it's, I don't know, sorry, I keep going on and on talking about it, but it's
no, I love it. That's why that's why I asked.
Yeah, and that's how music certainly played into that idea of how I think flavor comes together, and I can make sense of it in my head at least.
Amazing. Yeah, I am not a musically inclined individual, unfortunately. I very much enjoy music, but I've never played anything. And so it's very interesting to hear you talk about it. I know enough about music vocabulary to be dangerous and understand what you're saying, but I think the analog kind of metaphors that you're mentioning, as far as like treble, bass, and mid, like tones, and the way that you can kind of layer flavor, the way that you layer sound in order to create a really holistic, symphonic kind of full body experience. In my opinion, like this is what separates really amazing world-class beer and world-class music from like more simple kind of sophomoric, easy, and I guess kind of I don't know what the word would be. Like you're just kind of adding two and two and it equals four. Like I don't know. There's so much more that you can do when you kind of break things apart and then try to put them back together again, if that makes sense.
100%. And I use that now as being more of a teacher. I'm trying to teach people how to blend. I try to use that idea, that metaphor, because like you said, it's kind of easy to understand, where if you put it in the sense of like, this is kind of bass and this is mids and this is trebles, and how we're going to put all this together. And then you can back into that. Like, where does this come from in relation to age and residual sugar and bitterness and roast and all these things that are more beer focused? But if you keep pulling it back to the analogy, then it keeps your brain kind of cataloging it, and it helps it make sense. Just because it's funny, like as you were talking, I was thinking about, like, if you hear like a brass line warm up and you hear them play like a simple chord progression, the final note as they cut off and how it just, the resonance there, that feeling is so satisfying. And it's not too dissimilar to like a beautiful beer resonates on your palate. Your senses of absorbing it are different, but the satisfaction you have is there, where in one sense you want to hear more, in the other sense you should want to taste more. I don't know. And that's just like a place I want to be in.
Totally. It's interesting too, because I think about in making beer and talking about balance, right? I think for both of us, balance is one of the most important elements of a really well-made beverage, whether it be wine or beer or cocktail or whatever. How do you achieve that balance? How do you know, rather, that you have achieved that balance? And I think I hadn't really thought about it like this before, but in listening to you speak, it's like it is like a resolution of the tension between the elements of the thing, right? When that bitterness,
I like that.
Yeah, when that bitterness can kind of like, it's present, it's there, you're engaging with that sensorial experience, but then the bitterness, it doesn't sit there and linger, right? It dances with the sweetness and it dances with the acidity. And at the end of the sip, there is resolution. There isn't like one thing lingering on your palate, hanging out when it shouldn't be, loitering, on your palate. It is very much like a succinct completion of a sensory experience. Very interesting to think about.
Yeah, I love it. I love the way you put that. It's just there's balance in all different ways, and I think you're right that you create tension with one way or another. Understanding the intensity of a beer kind of helps you put that on a plane of perspective, where I think you can achieve balance in a 14% barrel aged stout as much as you can in a 3% table beer. How you're going to get there is going to be totally different, but they should have a resolution as you drink them where you're like, yeah, I'm here for this. And, your consuming behavior will be different with those things, but they're supposed to be, right. They're not all ballads and they're not all hits, you gotta try different songs. So it's kind of the same kind of way.
Yeah. I love that. Let's see. So I feel like over the years, especially the last maybe 3 to 5 years, many of our brewer friends, our mutual brewer friends, I feel like there's kind of I feel like people have been pretty jaded, over the last few years, and talking about, or having this conversation anyway, and kind of getting to the root of why we do what we do and what gets us really excited about beer. I'd like to transition a little bit and talk about the future of the industry and kind of, if you were to put on some rose-colored glasses and look 3 to 5 years into the future, what do you see for the industry? What do you feel like, I don't know, what are you excited about? What do you think brewers should be looking at? What do you think consumers might be transitioning into over the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think, man, it's a tough one. There's an interesting thing where, like, I probably would have told you that I know more than I do at 6 years than at 10 years, if that makes any sense at all, where I think we were in such a time over the last decade of this whirlwind of like we went from 2,000, 1,500 breweries in the US when we opened up to now there's like 10,000. And there's this like gold rush of things happening where you can do no wrong. And there's a lot of enthusiasm from consumers, to where I think it's hard for us, in that passion and that fervor, to really take that step back and really look at it as like a larger perspective. Even in the American beer scene, if you think about what Sierra Nevada opened up in like 78, something like that, or whatever, when they, started with their stout, and then later on the pale ale, and then looking into the 90s, you have the class of the 90s, a lot of brands, like a lot of breweries open up in the mid 90s, like 95, 96. You see like the big guys, I think that's when like Stone and Goose and Deschutes and all those folks opened around that time. And then their perspective is going to be completely different, than where we are now. And I think before, they were just trying to get anybody to pay attention to beer with flavor. And now we're saying, maybe not that flavor. I want you to subscribe to my particular flavor. And I think where our opportunity lies is realizing that, like, one, when you're making a decision on what kind of business you want to have, you have to be realistic with who your audience is. If not everyone can be Beyonce and also force feed classical music down people's throats, right? There's a choice you have to make, right? You got to figure out who and how big your audience is, and then how to reach them. And I think that's the most important thing. When you've got a small brewery and you can sell most everything you do in your tasting room, and you have a direct consumer, you have so much opportunity then to indoctrinate people when they step inside your walls. This is what we're all about. This is kind of flavors we do. This is, who we are. You have the people interaction with your staff in the tasting room, asking, what kind of beers you guys make. And through that, you can kind of be evangelistic to whatever your craft is. You see most lager brewers that are hot right now, I think, have that approach where there is an evangelism to lagers, and you get it by going in the door and in the brewery. That buying decision is completely different than someone who's going to the local grocery store and picking up a 6-pack for the weekend or whatever, And I think there's just this realization, I think, where people had, where it's like, it's not, you can't just do whatever you want, right? You have to have some realism in what's out there. But I do see, just like with anything in life, this too shall pass, right? There is a change, constant evolution that's happening, and there's a pendulum swing where, if you look historically with beer, I think pushing into the 90s, a lot of people were making classic styles. You have the funny, colloquialism of like the 95 pub menu, where everything was named after color. We have a blonde ale, a red ale, a brown ale, or whatever. And then it developed more into specialization as people wanted to have more words associated with their beers, and that allowed more license for brewers to go try more things. And then there was this kind of gold rush that I think happened for maybe more recent times, where people are like, holy cow, some people are making a ton of money with hazy IPAs selling direct to consumer. And that fueled a lot of people in the industry jumping on that bandwagon. But I think that's kind of dropped out a little bit. Part of that is that it's not necessarily gone. I would imagine there's more hazy IPA now being sold than ever before, but it's because it's not this mystery on how to make it. Like, if you hang your hat on creating a product that you think no one else can do, it's only a matter of time before somebody else can do it. And so there's this change happening there too. If you saw, if you look at IPAs in general with bitterness, there was that, was it like 2010? It was like, how bitter can you make this? Where it was like McKellar came out with that like 10,000 IBU beer or some shit like that, which is kind of crazy. All the way to now, where it's like, people are making beers that are very, very sweet, or there's a pendulum balance there. It's like a thermostat curve. I think we're seeing opportunities now where there are pockets of flavor happening all over the US that I've witnessed, where I was just out in LA. We're opening up our brewery here out there in probably about a month or so, finally, in downtown LA. And West Coast IPAs have still remained very, very king in that area, but they're not nearly as bitter as they used to be. There's some, I don't know how many would admit to it, but there's been some kind of learnings from the other side of the aisle, if you will. But then you also see lagers popping up and nuggets everywhere. We're seeing a fair amount of enthusiasm around English beers. Like we have a pretty steady cask ale program going on now, which I'm really excited about. And those things aren't necessarily going, like, we're a pretty big brewery. Our cask ales are not, even the ones that make it in a can, are not going to the grocery stores. They're in the places where people want to go to have those experiences. And I think the experience around those flavors is kind of all about the experience as a whole, where in dining, people are wanting to try more things, but it's also about the experience you have when you go into that restaurant. So I think the future is allowed for versatility. There's always people saying like the bubble's bursting, and frankly, until we're at the place where restaurants, where you have great restaurants closing, then, because it's tough, I don't think we're at a bubble burst. I think the bar is getting higher on what it takes to stay open and be relevant. And our industry as a whole is really young. It's not like we went from 1,500 breweries to 10,000 breweries, and all those 10,000 breweries have decades of experience making beer. I think all those breweries are culminating experience now in their craft and how they're connecting with the consumer. So I think over time, the idea that beer is here is going to be here for a while. I would imagine we'll still continue to see some consolidation at the top. That seems to be kind of a trend we've seen recently, where you've got some of the bigger breweries consolidating to be able to make market moves against the big guys, where at first we saw the big guys buying up some small guys, and now we see some small guys merging to be able to compete with the big guys. And there's going to continue to be stuff like that. But there's also, I think, the local brewery of the corner pub is here to stay for some time. America kind of always wanted it to be there. Culture always wanted it to be there. I think it just, we had a big lag from prohibition that waited for everyone to catch back up. I don't think that's going anywhere. So that's I think we'll continue to see innovation in classic styles, continue to see people wanting to try various things, and continue to see small breweries hang their hat on something, where people like you still exist doing what you do, people who make all lagers still exist doing what they do. And it's about creating an experience for people to come in and enjoy it. I think you just have to be realistic on that 5-year plan, where you can't assume that the bottom's never going to drop out and over leverage yourself. You have to do slow, steady growth. And if anything we've learned from the people before us, it's that slow, steady growth has been king. And to be realistic and about what you want. But I don't know. That's my take on it. I'm really excited to see people excited about drinking beers. And I still think there's an amazing amount of room for education. It's just, you wouldn't imagine how many people you still give a beer to. They're like, I only like this, or I only drink this. And you're like, well, here's not that. And they're like, oh, this is amazing. It's like, see, you like other things, So I think there's a lot of opportunity out there with just getting regular people on board. The biggest question that I really don't know, that's always fascinating to me, and I think a lot of beverage people are asking themselves right now, are like, what are younger people drinking? There's a hard realization that we're not young anymore. I mean,
True.
We're young, but we're not in our 20s anymore. And it's something to understand, is like asking what does a person who was me, back in the day, what does a 23-year-old want to drink now, or 25-year-old, or it's interesting to see what they're kind of going after. And it's always kind of surprising to me, but we'll see, and then those kids will turn into brewers and teach us stuff. That's just going to be how it is.
I love that. I look forward to that day. Yeah, I agree with all of that wholeheartedly. I have a baby sister, and she is 25 years old, and I pretty regularly am asking her, like, what are you drinking these days? And what are your friends drinking? She's like, I don't know, whatever's around. Like, there isn't really, she does not seem to have a really specific beverage that she gravitates towards. And from the conversations that I've had with her, that's kind of the same across her cohort. So I agree with you. It'll be interesting to begin to observe the patterns within, Gen Z and younger, and see what they're interested in, um, and see how innovation begins to evolve within the beer industry, um, over time. Because I feel like over the last 10 years, we've watched innovation go from being like flavor innovation,
Hmm.
to being like process innovation. And then I think there was more recently kind of this intersection of both flavor and process and ingredients, where you'd see innovation coming from different types of like hop products being developed, and things like that. So where innovation will go from here, I think, is a really interesting thing to think about, because at this point, flavors. How many different flavor? I'm trying, but like, how many flavor combinations can you come up with that are novel?
Yeah,
Um,
I mean the hops are interesting because with the hop products, what that has changed is this, like basically the speed limit that is pre-described, right? Like, there's a certain amount of things in your process. Like if you can only have so much T90 go into your whirlpool before you can no longer have a clean wort stream, then that's your limit. That's how much you can put in your whirlpool. Well, when you start having flowable hop products that are not leaf material, that changes the speed limit on your whirlpool. Also changes what you can accomplish in other parts of, like as we see more people doing cool pooling, like where there's, all right, let's put a heat exchanger between our kettle and our whirlpool. Then it changes where your bitterness is coming from. So then you have a new speed limit on where you can influence flavor otherwise. Now you see people putting those products like in the fermenter as they're knocking out, and because of that, you don't have as much problems with like sulfur compounds coming from the extra leafy material in your fermentation. So, then you are able to push where hot flavor can go there. So those innovations are absolutely changing where the limits are as far as flavor introduction. But then I think on the other side, you're right. I still think there's opportunity out there where, like, if you look at like IRI data, then you see like people are, a cream ale, like a flavored cream ale, is got growth to it, things like that, where it's like, is that really playing in this world, or is that just what, works in like a grocery store marketing? And it's really interesting to see how those are two separate things, but they're all beer. A really weird thing, I'll tell you this, is that about a year and a half ago, we developed this line called Neon Cylinders, and it's we call it an intensely fruited sour ale. It's a kettle sour. As you know, we've been making Athena, our Berliner Weiss. We've been making that for a decade, and it's a 4.5% Berliner Weiss. I love that beer. It's beautiful. But then I was like, well, if people are talking about how things are too sour, I think there's a great lesson you learn from wine, is that alcohol and acid are great balancing agents against each other. So Neon Cylinders is an 8% kettle sour that we just matched the intensity with fruit. And it's now our number one seller in our tasting room on a regular basis.
wow.
Where like Tropicalia will always come behind that. And so will Classic City Lager, which are usually like our top two. And that's, our tasting room in the middle of a college town, which is, to go back to like what 22 to 25-year-olds are drinking or whatever. It's really interesting to see like people identify with that. And we serve it in a stained glass, the traditional Kolsch glass. So it is a neon cylinder. You see all the colors around the tasting room. It's pretty fun. And, just one of those things where it's like, don't take everything too seriously, like,
Yes.
let's just have fun with it. And the brand vibe on that is like Miami Vice meets Drive the movie. It's just like, let's go have like the color, like all of them are named like magenta beans or hot pink, or things like that, where it's just this kind of, it's about a vibe instead of just, hey, here's a kettle sour with fruit. But I don't know, there's a lot of,
I
it'll be
love
interesting to
that.
see how that keeps to grow and what happens.
I guess we'll have to just keep watching. I'm gonna have to, maybe, since I'm out here in Atlanta at the moment, I might have to go out there to Athens and try some of these neon cylinders. Get
There you
lit
go.
on 8% neon beer.
It's all about balance. We've got
Yeah,
those,
exactly.
and we've also got like a 4% rice lager.
Yeah, that sounds
And in both
lovely.
of those, we like to use local ingredients. So, you have your little things, you pick and choose.
Yeah, I love that. Well, I think we've been chatting for about an hour now, and I think I've got one last question for you to wrap up this amazing conversation. It's a question that I was asked on my conversation, the last episode with Lindsay, and I believe Andrea asked her this question when she was being interviewed. And that question is, what is currently bringing you joy, Blake?
Oh man, my dog.
Aw,
um,
yeah.
and I really like the opportunities I get, like connecting to people. That's always kind of been my fun thing. And that's my favorite thing about beer. And so that, and then to bring it back to what we were talking about earlier, I think really from a job perspective, the most rewarding thing is seeing and helping people be better versions of themselves. I say that with humility, not that I'm like the most amazing version of myself. We're all in this growth trajectory. But helping other people be able to see a dream come to life, or an idea, or give them the tools to be able to make this thing they've always wanted to make, or tell the story, or an event. We're all like, I don't know, as you get older, I think you try to recognize that we're all on this human journey and we're all doing our best. Even the people that you don't like or you think you disagree with, they're probably doing their best too, and helping people along that journey and doing their best, that probably brings me the most true joy that lasts, where I can see that I help the person figure something out, or do something they're proud of. That's ultimately way cooler than making a barrel aged stout that people rate high on Untapped. That's cool for about 5 seconds, and then it kind of goes away. So seeing someone that's like, man, I get to do this, and I'm a better version of myself. That's really the goal and the quest, for sure.
Oh, I absolutely love that and couldn't agree more. Well, Blake, it has been amazing chatting with you, and I look forward to our conversations in the future. Thanks for taking the time to chat.
I really, truly appreciate, you could have asked anybody. I appreciate the invite to talk to you, Averie. It's always a joy.
No. Well, everyone, Blake will be back on the next episode of this show as the host, having a conversation with a brewer of his choosing. That will be on the air in 2 weeks, so make sure you tune in for that. Visit allaboutbeer.com and follow on social media. And to support journalism in the beer space, check out patreon.com/allaboutbeer. I'm Averie Swanson of Keeping Together, and thank you for listening to the Brewer to Brewer podcast.
First Tee is a proud sponsor of the Brewer to Brewer podcast. Some of the brightest brewers across the country have discovered the First Tee advantage. Hill Farmstead, Sweetwater Brewing Company, and Angry Chair are among the many who have used First Tee's unique and quality teas and botanicals to create top-rate beers. First Tee focuses on being direct, flexible, and fast. You can find out more about First Tee's collaboration with brewers and tea ingredients by visiting firsttee.com/blog. That's FIRSDTEA.com/blog.